Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to cover trends today, so let's get started. The big question for today, are trends bad? I think in order to answer or ask that question, it also begs the question, are trends good? What are the pros and cons of trends? In order to make informed design decisions, it's important to understand the life cycles of trends and to always be aware of the current landscape of trends. As controversial as this topic is, it's not as black and white as it seems. I've seen a lot of people hating on Pinterest because it keeps us in this place of regurgitating trends. But after we go over everything today, I think it's obvious that this conversation is much bigger than Pinterest and that the blame can't just fall on a tool. So, to really understand and dive into trends today, let's look at the history of design trends. There's this amazing Taschen book where they cover all sorts of design trends through the decades. So this one in particular covers 1890, which is way, way back, all the way through today, and covers even a lot of the nuances of those decades or periods and the cultural impact of what culture's impact was on design and things that were happening at the time. And so I think that is still relevant today, but it's really interesting to see all of these different trends through the decades and seeing all of this like brutalist design and the Bauhaus movement. And we had a lot of like war influence in the 40s. And of course, a lot of psychedelic stuff in the 70s. And so, yeah, I mean, trends is not a new topic by any means, and is definitely something that we can really see and look at over the decades too. So I really encourage you to get this book because it even fills out this topic of trends even more. How trend cycles work. Luckily, we've learned a lot about trends from fashion and interior design. And the theory is there's two kinds of trends. There's micro trends and macro trends. So for example, in fashion, micro trends last 3 to 5 years and macro trends cycles last 5 to 10 years. That's why we connect specific decades with trends. Dropped waist dresses from the 20s, bell bottoms from the 70s, butterfly clips were so cool in the 2000s. And then eventually trends come back every 20 years or so. For example, high-rise jeans were popular from the 70s through the 90s and then came back 20 years later in the late 2010s. And as we saw, this same cycle happens with design too, which brings us to what's trending right now. This is kind of a mapped out version of seeing a new trend usually picks up in probably less than a year, I would say, and then they turn into either micro trends or macro trends. And the micro trend is probably going to last, like we were seeing on the previous slide, 3 to 5 years or maybe 1 to 2 years, and then the macro trend going on up to 10 years. And then those trends become outdated and are out for probably about 10 to 12 years before that 20-year span starts over again. So I'm going to cover 18 of the biggest trends in design right now. I've done my best to label the following trends as either new, micro, macro, or out, basically what we just saw on the previous slide. Some of this is just for fun and completely subjective and biased in my own experiences and surroundings too. So keep that in mind. You may or may not agree with some of these trends that we're going to cover today. So first trend, we're calling this nostalgia, 70s psychedelic. I would call this a macro trend. I think that it's obvious that this has been around for a while and isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So some of the details of this is we're getting a lot of like hippie vibes, a lot of flowers and happy faces and even peace signs and things like that. And then we're also getting a lot of psychedelic stuff too. So and sometimes psychedelic also bridges over into Art Nouveau. So we see Art Nouveau typography, we see Art Nouveau flourishes on things, and that is, I think, extending this trend even more. So it definitely started in a more hippie space and is now merging into even more psychedelic designs and influences. And we're just now seeing some more Art Nouveau stuff pop up. I would say in even the last year or so. And then we're looking at typography that reminds us of the 70s, where it's really heavy bottoms and very curved type, kind of gloopy type, and having a lot of really cool psychedelic moves and abstract designs as well. Trend number 2, another nostalgia one, is Y2K and 2000s. And so I think that's something else to keep in mind with trends is sometimes they pop up from any decade from the past, and it really is a point of nostalgia too, because in this particular case, the reason we're seeing this is because it's almost treating digital design as artifacts. So it's like, remember when computers used to look like this, and some of the people designing it didn't even live in that time too. So it's really much about, it feels even cooler to bring it up because it's something that they didn't live through, and they're like, I really want to bring this back, or this was so cool, let's bring it back, kind of a thing. But this trend definitely leans into this really happy, bubbly space. There's a lot of lavenders and pinks and blues, and butterfly clips again, and little starbursts too, and basically thinking about old school computers too. Oh, sorry, one more note on this. I'm thinking of this as a micro trend too. So it's a pretty dense trend. It's something that is very obvious and very saturated. And we've only been seeing this pop up in probably the last year or two, very post-pandemic kind of a trend that's hitting. So I kind of see this as being a micro trend. Trend number 3, geometric simplicity. This is a big macro trend that we've been seeing for a while now. And it's very much rooted in very simple graphic shapes. I especially think of half circles or these dome shapes as being a very iconic part of this trend. And so seeing that in even interior design and in rug designs and textile designs, all the way through to packaging that we're seeing here, and the packaging being all about a single shape, for example, and then even using it as masks. So we're seeing that in digital design and web design, that these shapes become masks for a lot of imagery as well. Trend number 4, collage and maximalist. So this is especially coming from an anti-minimalist movement and coming from post-pandemic kind of an influence too. So a lot of people wanting to bring in a lot of playfulness, and it's kind of this Renaissance movement too of really diving into creativity and headstrong creativity too, and just diving right in and putting anything and everything on your canvas. And so this maximalist movement, I would say, is a new trend, is definitely something that's just barely popping up in the last year. And it's all about mixing and matching fonts, using as many fonts as possible in a single design, and is even using one word, multiple fonts in a single word, and a lot of different design details and elements and shapes again too. So yeah, it's definitely kind of an overwhelming, but an intentional overwhelm too. Trend number 5, retro stickers. You've probably seen a lot of these around lately. I would say this is probably a micro trend, but who knows, it might even really be in for the long haul and be around and become a macro trend. But it's all about creating all sorts of little bite-sized information and kind of quirky phrases and sayings, and putting those into a sticker, and that becoming part of packaging or even web design. It's kind of this idea of bringing analog into the digital space too. So I think that's a lot of what we're seeing today too, is a lot of people being sick of so much digital design and digital spaces and wanting to bring in as much analog into it as possible. And so that's when we see things like textures and some of these movements where we're trying to create something that feels almost tactile. And so, so yeah, a lot of these kind of retro feeling stickers where it's like, hey, there's a sale here, or, you know, groovy or smiley faces or whatever it might be to add a lot of personality to the brand. Trend number 6, gradients and candy colors. This one is definitely a macro trend. We saw it probably when it probably started back in 2016 when Instagram changed their logo from the old vintage Instagram camera to what it is now, which is this very like abstract, complex gradient, multicolor gradient. And so that's what we're seeing with a lot of packaging now too, and website design, where it's not only gradients, but gradients with a lot of these candy colors too, very sweet and sugary, and creating a lot of movement with color. I think gradients had their moment probably 20 or so years ago and are basically coming back in a new form, and a lot of people are loving them and leaning into them more and more. Trend number 7, 3D worlds. So as more and more people are picking up 3D design and there's more programs more available out there to really figure out 3D design, then people are creating these 3D worlds where sometimes it looks very 3D and very poppy and graphic and simple, and sometimes it looks very detailed and almost as if you can't tell if it's a rendering or if it's actually an image. But noticing brands like Nike and IKEA even using these things, and a lot of this is pulled into motion design too, of course, and seeing some of these elements move and fall and all of that. So I'm thinking of this as a macro trend because it's definitely more of a technique of a trend than a style, and a technique that probably isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and a lot more and more people will learn it and incorporate it into their designs. Trend number 8 is kind of piggybacking off of what we just talked about. Now 3D meets 2D. This is a new trend that has been popping up in the last year or so, where it's definitely more rooted in and seen in typography, where there's a lot of 2D typography and then bringing in one element that's going to be 3D, or a logo or an abstract shape or something like that to create this layer of 3D and 2D living simultaneously. Trend number 9, happy mascots. I'm calling this one another new trend. It's definitely popping up and getting more and more saturated over the last year, where we're going back to these old retro mascot ideas that are probably from the 50s and 60s. And of course, some of those mascots have been around all of this time. You can think of probably several brands that had mascots back in the day and still have them around. I especially think of cereal boxes and restaurants, for example, but we're seeing them popping up even on packaging now, and a lot of brands bringing in this happy mascot that's really just usually only seen in one color, but then in this Jibby can, we can see that it could even be brought out in 2 colors, but it's definitely a much more minimal approach to a mascot, and even taking the product and personifying it and putting a face on it and legs and arms on it, and could be as simple as that. But that's definitely a trend that is probably going to pop up more and more, but definitely something that's newer. Okay, trend number 10, neon green or yellow. This one's probably a micro trend, has been happening a couple years now, and might still keep happening too. But I would say another note for all of these trends is you can tell that it's becoming a trend when bigger brands are using it, and not just designers or boutique agencies or things like that. So that's when you know it's really hit the trend, is now it's becoming a micro trend or a macro trend, is we're seeing bigger brands that are accepting it and wanting to play a part in it as well. So we've got Spotify and Sweetgreen definitely leaning into these neon green, neon yellow color tones, and mostly a pop of color too. So it becomes like the loud color or the loud element with a lot of more subdued things around it. Trend number 11, loopy logos. I kind of think that maybe this started with Airbnb, but I could be wrong. But there's this idea of kind of having a fun little flair into the logo and adding that in, and even doing it in a word mark or in a symbol. But the word mark is usually maybe one letter has the little loop happening to it, or maybe two letters. Things like GoDaddy Studios really leaning into that for their logo mark. And of course, Upwork having their UP ligature with the little swoop loopy loop thing happening too. And I think this is a macro trend because Airbnbs came out quite a few years ago, and a lot more brands are doing this too. And I would say it's not such a dense, like heavy trend too. It's something fairly subtle that we'll probably continue to see within logo design in the coming years. And then trend number 12, this is oversized logos. This is more of a technique, but something that we're definitely seeing is everyone wants their logo bigger, better, louder. They're doing it on packaging, they're doing it on websites. You get to a landing page and the logo's taking up your screen, or you scroll all the way down to the footer and the logo is spanning the width of your screen. We're seeing them wrapped around packaging too. The logo's so big, it has to be wrapped around, or even in this Gidget bag reference, it's getting cropped. It's so big that it's being cut off too. So I think that's definitely part of that trend too, is not being able to see the full logo at once or seeing it getting cropped too. And it's definitely this idea of, I would say sometimes it's very showing up very contrasted too. So that would be the only big element and everything else is really small. Or seeing how it's kind of trying to be loud and proud and quirky in that sense too. Or a textural moment like this bite box in the lower right, where it's creating more of a graphic element and shapes and abstracts the logo a bit when you make it so big. And then we're also seeing it in entertainment too. So I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but when you watch TV and the intro logo of that series or something like that is going to be this huge logo that's going to just slap across your screen, I would say that's definitely part of this trend as well. Trend 13, heavy and ink trap type. So this is a new trend that's definitely popping out in the last year or so, where it probably leans into some of that nostalgia stuff that we were talking about, especially with the 70s and all of that, but it's kind of taking its own form as well, especially ink trap type. Was definitely a function that we don't need anymore, but now people are bringing it into digital spaces too, and even Nordstrom Racks, very trendy. They're really leaning into the trends with their new logo. Has that very dense, blocky type too. So whether it's in the typography of a design or in actual logo design itself, we're really seeing this trend picking up, and these like very dense logos and type. Trend 14, elegant script type. So this is probably another nostalgia thing, and I would say also leans into the maximalist space as well. but there's this idea of suddenly creating these like mixed collage and maybe styles and emotions into a brand where bringing in something that's very elegant and script-like can either elevate the brand or just make it look really cool. And they'll even designers will even drop a letter and put a single script letter in place of that letter, or they'll use it in conjunction with serifs or sans serifs. But this is definitely a micro trend that's been out for a couple of years and maybe will fade or maybe will stick around for a while. And then let's talk about trends that are either on their way out or definitely out. This idea of blush and millennial pink, it's still trickling in, and I think it's trickling and staying around because of bigger brands kind of a little delayed in their trends too, but who knows? I mean, maybe this will continue to stay, but I think this was definitely a macro trend that had really lived its time and been around for 10 or so years. And a lot of people thought that maybe they'd be the only one that would have this all blush, all pink package. And then now everyone has it, and now they're not the only one. And I think those are the times when it's really good to look left and right and be aware of your neighbors and make sure that you're not just looking like the rest of your industry or looking like everything else on the shelf. But we've seen it with Glossier and Acne Studios and Nike, and even Levain Bakery had it out for a little bit. And all of that. Even Honest Beauty caught on to the trend as well. But I would say if people are still using this today, I think the first thing I think about is, oh, they're behind on trends. And I think this is definitely on its way out, if not out by now. Trend 16 is what I'm kind of calling Picasso and Matisse, grouping these two artists together. A lot of people being very inspired by them, and it's suddenly coming back in a very saturated way where it's this very cut paper styled plants and fruit and then faces. So this abstracted line art, almost blind contour feeling Picasso faces that are showing up as logos and even as artwork for interior design. And yeah, definitely seeing a lot of these bigger brands like Chobani and Giant and Care of leaning into that Matisse style and that cut paper style too. And I would say that this, it's kind of hard to say if this was really a full 10-year macro trend, but it's definitely on its way out. I think maybe the Matisse is probably going to keep lingering a little longer, but I would say it's already very saturated. So if you're using this now or using it still, it'd be good to really like check back, make sure that that's really needed, because otherwise you're just leaning into an old trend. Trend 17 is this idea of vintage and retro badges. I kind of put two labels on this. It's both macro trend and out. I think it's this phase that we saw probably popping up a good 10 years ago, maybe even 12 or 13 years ago, like very 2010, 2011, 2012, where this idea of, again, going back to analog approaches and hand-drawn approaches to graphic design and being anti-digital and wanting it to feel as human as possible and human made too and not computer made. And so it's definitely a much more of that like anti kind of a trend, and makes a lot of sense for a lot of mom and pop shops and these boutique brands that want to feel like they've been around for a while or that they existed in the turn of the century or whatever it might be. And so a lot of that is definitely this more like retro inspired, vintage inspired design. And who knows, maybe this will never go away, but is definitely a macro trend that's kind of fading, and less people are doing this, and they're leaning into some of those first few pages that we just saw where people are really shifting away And so I would say this is also kind of out, and kind of this idea of not wanting to create these like dense badges and overly textured designs. And then this one, I would say is probably most recently out, a macro trend that's lasted for a really long time, where especially in packaging and in just consumerism in general, a lot of this became much like, of course, minimalism has always been around for designers and for like purists and minimalists and all of that, but this also became such a macro trend when even like, you know, the average person or the everyday person really loved this style too and really leaned into it. And all of a sudden, people that didn't really care about their homes or interiors or things that they bought before are suddenly like, oh, I love how minimal this is. And it was definitely standing out on the shelves because we were coming out of the 90s and the 2000s where it was like tons of logos, tons of pictures and colors on a single package. And now it's starting to feel like everyone has minimalism and every brand is leaning into minimalism. And it's very, it's the kind of minimalism where it's literally just black and white, just the logo slapped onto a package, kind of an idea. And a lot more and more clients I'm noticing are still asking for this and while not being fully aware that they're going to look just like everyone else too. And so I would say that's probably why this is on its way out or out, because we just got out of the pandemic, and that is a big reason why a lot of people are moving away from minimalism, is because now they're going into that maximalist space, and now they're going into the nostalgia place and really leaning into those places and kind of walking away from minimalism. Those were our 18. I know 18 is such a weird number. It's like 15 felt like not enough, but 20 felt like so much. I felt like I could keep going with more and more ideas of different trends too, but kept it to 18, and those definitely felt like the most relevant to cover as well. But let's talk about key takeaways from this. So one thing to remember is context is everything, because context is core to meaning. Design is rooted in meaning, and we really need to discover and think about the context of that meaning. Know what you're pulling inspiration from. Knowing what you're pulling inspiration from could be a key element to the purpose of your design, but leaning into trends just because it's cool can quickly get lost in a sea of sameness. The best ideas never come out of thin air, but also the best ideas are aware of what's around them and how they want to be perceived in that trending sea. So making sure you're aware of those things and of your surroundings for sure. The second key takeaway is design with strategy. Maybe the audience is very young and the brand needs to feel trendy, or maybe it's a seasonal design that you know doesn't have to last long, or maybe the strategy is rooted in a trend. At the end of the day, the design should start with strategy and thinking of what the purpose needs to be. And then prove trends to clients. Sometimes clients are the ones that are pushing outdated trends on us. We've all been there and cringed about that, and sometimes designed anyways. But if we are the experts and know more about design trends than our client, I think that can be a conversation to have with them. I think of this as being a give and take method, where if you're showing multiple versions or multiple options, giving them one that they want, and then showing them the things that you think will be better based on trends too, and talking that out too, and saying, we know you like this and wanted to show what that looks like, but also want to point out that you'll look just like all of these other brands and that you'll be sitting on the shelf with, or really helping them to understand the context of these trends and the implications of those decisions. And then the last thing, challenge your design. The next time you're working on a logo, ask yourself these questions. Have I seen this done before? Is this based on a current trend that's happening in the last year? Is this design rooted in a purpose or strategy from the brand or for the brand? Or is it inspired by something from 20 plus years ago? So wanting to really understand and the reason why, I think that really takes us back to that question of, is design bad? But really, or I mean, are trends bad? But really, trends can be a purpose to your design, and it can be a strategy, or timeless might be the strategy for the design, because it needs to be a brand that needs to last for the next 20 years, for example. So you really want to break free from that 20-year cycle. So I would say keeping a lot of that in mind, and giving a reason for using certain trends or avoiding certain trends, I think can really be a part of the strategy of design. And then that's everything. We have a Q&A, and I'll of course turn it back over to Tara, but I just started a YouTube channel at nice.people, and then of course she'll pass along my links to how to find me on Instagram and on TikTok too. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Tara.
Amber, thank you so much for such a fun presentation. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that. And okay, and then a great question coming in from Jennifer. How do you prefer to stay on top of emerging trends?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think it just happens, and I think it happens by default. Like obviously, not like living in a bubble, but being on social media and watching and being aware of different websites that highlight and feature design and talk a lot about design. And then, of course, even just being out in grocery stores and at different places too, like seeing it in person, I think is a very telling sign of, oh, I'm seeing this everywhere now, or yeah, things like that. So I think it kind of just happens by default. But it also sometimes happens in the mood board phase of a process. So for every project that we work on at my studio, we have a mood board phase to really uncover the potential of a brand before we even design. So we're not wasting hours spinning our wheels, coming up with any and every design possible. And so we kind of gauge and try to get on the same page with the client of how bold they're willing to go, and or how much they really want to live in the spaces and ideas that they came with and entered the project with. And so it's really nice to kind of go over and talk about different designs out there, relevant brands, competitors, all of that. And going over all of that with clients on a regular basis is probably another way that I start to see things and notice things and think, oh, this is the second or third project where this kind of style or technique was brought in or talked about at the beginning. And so then that's probably when I'm noticing it more, is because I'm really in that research phase and kind of digging around and looking around.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Amber. And thanks for the great questions. Any follow-ups, feel free to share those in our chat as well. We have tons of great questions coming in. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in asking about Canva. So with Canva growing in popularity, how do you feel that it's, leading trends, and what do you see? A lot of people are saying that a lot of Canva templates look the same. How can you, customize those? People that use Canva, how is that influencing these trends?
Yeah, I would say that's a big influence, especially for clients and people who don't have the time or money to put into creating custom designs. And so I think that's the big challenge, is when you live in that space and when those clients want to keep using or reusing those templates, that's probably how a lot of people are going to start seeing. A lot of consumers are really smart today, and they'll notice the difference between a brand that's kind of living in this stunted place where it is leaning into a lot of templates and just reusing stuff, versus when it feels very custom to, and when it feels like a bigger brand with bigger ideas and a team of creativity kind of a thing. And so I think it's even noticeable with like websites, for example, where consumers are very familiar with a site that looks like it's a template versus a site that feels and looks custom. And that's something we talk through with our clients all the time, is this idea of you can either get a template and save cost, or you can level up and invest in creating a custom design and having a custom website, and that'll immediately set you apart from all of the templates out there, and you'll immediately become noticeable to your consumers as this brand that's leveled up, that's investing in themselves, and that leans into having an approach that feels very customized to them and unique to them and telling their story. But yeah, I mean, Canva is a little difficult because it is a lot of, I would say, designs that aren't really rooted in strategy, and people just picking up and grabbing designs for the sake of having something designed.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. Thank you, Amber. And moving right along here so we can try to cover as many of these as possible, I am seeing a few questions coming in surrounding the idea when you're trying to present new ideas to clients. And if they're kind of stuck on one of these outdated trends, how can you convince them to stay fresh and update and um, kind of bringing in the new trends, and even if they might be stuck on their consistent design or these older trends.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the mood board approach definitely helps in introducing completely new concepts that they never thought about before, and seeing it in practice or seeing it in use. I think that helps them to know and understand that this is something that can work, or not something to be like afraid of. And so going into the actual design process and showing those options, I think that's when it is helpful to show options, because it's again that give and take method of showing the design that they are asking for and then showing the others. And part of the role of a designer is selling your designs too. And so when you finding ways to sell the designs that you think are really the appropriate for that brand, and really work well with the strategy for that brand, then I would say find as many ways as you can do to sell that, whether it's bringing in influences from the past and old references that might tie into the concept or the strategy of that brand, or really prefacing it. I would say leading up to a concept is a good method too, where even beyond the mood board phase, when you're going to present stuff, you might need to lead up to that, and you might need to start to backtrack and give reasoning behind your thinking and your design process all the way up until ta-da, here's that design. And that can be a really good approach in the actual presentation process, so that they can see and understand how you got from point A to point B, and how and why that matters so much. And then sometimes they'll surprise you, and when they come back with feedback after a few days and after they've really sat on it, they'll suddenly say, you're right, my initial idea I don't love, but I really love what you brought in here and want to keep going with that direction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, Thank you. And again, any follow-ups, feel free to share those with us in our chat as well. We have a great question coming in from Maggie. She's asking how many trends might be too many to use in one design. For example, 3D, candy colors, funky font, or gradients. Do you see successful executions that are using the trends, like multiple trends?
Yeah, in fact, I saw a lot of crossover even in putting this presentation together and trying to separate out trends. There were a few things that actually worked on several pages, and it was like, okay, we've got bold, chunky type, but it's also a really big logo slapped on there, and doing the oversized logo trend. And so I would say I think it's totally fine using multiple trends, and there probably, I mean, I don't imagine that there could be a limit to that either, as long as, the like design is still rooted in all of those like rudimentary design rules, of like hierarchy, and making sure the layout makes sense, and reading the information, and that it's not overwhelming, and that there's, of course, design skills set into that.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen some strategically kind of, strategic crossovers and trends as well that I think work well. Thank you. Okay, perfect. So again, moving right along here, we have a good question coming in from Joanna, and I've seen it from a couple of other people as well. What are your thoughts on AI and what might happen to the design landscape with all of this new technology getting involved?
Yeah, I would say I think AI will probably be a tool for designers. And it'll probably become, I mean, it's kind of like that Canva topic that we were just talking about, where it will probably become very obvious in the coming years of what was designed by AI and what was designed by a person. And it might even become obvious to the average consumer too. And so they might, I think sometimes, or I kind of imagine AI becoming a tool just like Adobe products are tools too. And so maybe it's a tool to have to execute something on a higher level and instilling deeper thinking and strategy behind it too. So it could certainly work in that sense. But I think when it falls flat is when there isn't any designer strategy behind it. And yeah, like I worry that it might create a sea of sameness too. So yeah, I think a lot of people will probably start to break out of these very AI maybe looking designs. Um, because yeah, I mean, I haven't really seen any good logos or typography come out of AI just yet. And so I think that it's still fairly behind in that sense. Um, but yeah, I'm very curious to see where that whole landscape takes us.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that's like such a big a whole nother conversation, really, with the
Mhm.
technology. So yeah, and please feel free to follow up with Amber after today's session as well. Her information is on screen and in our chat. A good question here coming in from Morgan. What if your target market is older? Do you continue to use older trends from their kind of prime time, or do you move towards the modern trends either way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really good question too, and I think that can be part of the strategy too. I mean, of course, audience is a big part of the strategy, and really knowing and understanding your audience and what they would gravitate towards, and trying to speak on their level. And so, having being familiar with that audience and what brands they're using or are loyal to can really pave the way and inform your design decisions as well. And I think having designs that feel timeless in that sense can be a really good strategy for a brand like that too, because it's not so trendy and it's not dated and it's trying to hit this perfect balance of it being timeless and something that could have existed 10 years ago or 10 years into the future. And so yeah, I would say for things like that, it's really good to lean in into the timeless and trying to stay away from something that feels dated as much as possible.
A really good question coming in from Allison, a little bit different. Do you find that metals shift with design trends at all? I remember when rose gold and copper was all the rage, but what about gold and silver? Do those come in and out as well, or would that just be limited to more fashion?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think, yeah, like I would say I've heard, I don't know if I've really seen this yet, but I heard silver is coming back for younger generations too, and silver jewelry and all of that. And so I bet that will pave or like really inform a lot of metallics and foils from design too, whether that's like a 3D metallic or printed kind of a thing. Because yeah, I think when gold was around, gold foil was very in. Everyone wanted like a gold foil business card or package. And so I could definitely, and then rose gold too. Yeah, like I think rose gold had um, definitely followed that like millennial blush pink trend too. And people were using both with design as well and for some other brands. And so I could definitely see that turning into this silver space even more so if silver really is coming back.
Um, Another good question coming in from Jamie. They're saying that they work for a large university, so designs and materials and campaigns tend to move very slow since there are a lot of people and teams involved. So sometimes that means that they've been inspired by a trend that ends up being implemented a little bit late. How might you navigate that kind of challenge?
When designs are influenced by a trend, it's probably good to lean into something that's really fresh and really new, or something that's just starting to pop up, so that if and when it does get implemented in 2 years, it might still be a trend and might still be this like macro trend kind of a thing. Um, but again, I think for things like that, I think that's like definitely part of this trend conversation of maybe it's best to avoid trends for something that might be a while before it actually comes out. Um, or if it's something that's temporary, I mean, it's hard because universities are also very youthful, and in order for universities to speak to college students, it should be trendy, and the those trendy things can really benefit speaking to that audience, and that audience really gravitating towards it. And so it's kind of this tricky thing where it might be good to do new trends, but also have most of it feel as timeless as possible. But I think again, it probably depends on like what the actual design is for and when it'll be implemented and all of that. But I would say like keep pushing through and pushing through a lot of that stuff, and like encouraging it and being the one that's really like helping encourage teams to like move into some things if they feel stuck or stagnant.
Yeah, so I think we have time for one more. This is a good question coming in from Jeff. Um, in your opinion, are there any current trends that are being overused and may push them through the cycle more quickly?
Yeah, I would say some of the things that we went over at the beginning were definitely more of these like popular starting to become really saturated. But again, it's weird because trends also have specific spaces that they live within. And so you might see a trend very saturated in a specific industry or space or type of designer, but you might not see it in another space either. And so yeah, I think being aware of those things really matters too. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think like this maximalist trend is like, while it's really cool and funky and gets really wild, I think that's going to be one that's going to get tired very quickly. And and I would say the 70s like hippie nostalgia trend is like very dense right now too. And the more and more people are using it, I think the more and more tired it's going to become, and will quickly be some of those out trends that we went over that you were probably like, oh yeah, I've seen this around for a while.
Yeah, 100%. And we did get a few questions as well about different trends for different industries. So again, I'm going to encourage you to please follow up with Amber after today's session, because with that, that is all we have time for today. Thank you to every one of you who joined us today. Take care.